I'm Kate Phillip. I'm the program lead on the Presidential Employment Stimulus and your chair on this session today, which is about a sustainable economic recovery. And many of the programs, many of the presentations today are research into the outcomes of interventions in the context of the pandemic, where a range of emergency measures and emergency programs were initiated in the spirit of never letting a good crisis go to waste. There was a lot of innovation in this period, which has allowed for interesting new analysis, research data that can help us inform what works and what doesn't work in dealing with crisis economic contexts and the context of supporting recovery. And the link to that with the just transition context is, of course, that it is its own kind of a crisis, and that the transitions involved in transitioning, effecting a just transition, raise many of the same problems as we were confronting in the context of the pandemic. So it's a little bit of a leap, but at the same time, I think there are really good lessons to be learned from what we have learned and are still learning from the process of economic intervention supporting and non-economic interventions, as Kelly will be talking to, interventions supporting recovery in the context of turbulence, crisis, and transition. So we're going to start, and I can't deny my excitement at this one, with Josh Budlender on the stimulus effects of a large public employment program. This research was supported by AFD, as was the next one we're going to hear from. It's really a fascinating, both methodologically and in terms of the opportunity it created. It's hot off the press. I don't know how many times you presented it before yet, Josh.
Only once.
It's hot off the press. Yeah. So please, newcomers, please, you may have to get chairs from next door if we're short. We had to do that in the last session. But there are a couple of chairs in the front here. There are actually... We're actually fine. There are enough chairs, yeah, in the front. So, hot off the press, over to Josh.
Thanks. Do I need to stay here, or can I use the walking mic? I don't know. Oh, you're filming. Okay, so I must stay here.
The camera can follow you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, right. Thank you, Kate. No expectations being created there. Right, yes, so this is joint work with Ihsan Basir, who, like me, is also based at Saldru, though we both also have other part-time things. And just before beginning, I just want to say that this research would not have been possible without the support of the Presidency, of AFD, who funded the work and commissioned the work. You'll see there's a data partner here, which is called Omniscient, which is a data company, which you'll see the related. Harambee, Youth Employment Accelerator, provided key data. And then there's also a large South African retailer who provided data. This is really very much like joint work with all of them, and it wouldn't have been possible without that. But before, I just wanted to mention that explicitly. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is an evaluation of the PYEEBEEI program, which is the Department of Basic Education component of the Presidential Employment Stimulus. It's the largest component of the PES. In each cohort, they employ around 270,000 young people, and each phase has around 7 billion rands worth of funding. The key thing is that these youth are employed at the national minimum wage, which is unusual for public employment programs. And they do things like 2/3 of them do help with learning in classrooms, and about 1/3 do things like school maintenance and that kind of stuff. And the program is concentrated in low-fee or no-fee schools, so it's in poorer areas. And what we're going to look at particularly is the cohort 2, which were hired for 10 months because people were rehired between November 2021 and August 2022. Okay, so that's the program we're evaluating, but what are we looking at? Well, the first part is kind of how did the program affect participant expenditure? And that's not a particularly complicated question, but it's been very hard to answer up until now just because of data constraints. And what we're going to use is we're going to show you've got this very nice collaboration with using private data, with this, and the collaboration is made possible by this new technology, which allows us to use private data that doesn't, without compromising individual anonymity. But the question that we're trying to get to, we can only partially answer it, but it's the question that people are really interested in, is what are the how does the spending recirculate through the economy? Not just the effect on participants, but effects on the rest of the economy. And what people really want, which we can't quite get to, is an actual multiplier effect. You know, how many more jobs does this expending create? But we can get to kind of the first part of that, we think, which is we can estimate what we call the first round effects of the multiplier mechanism, which is that how much of the spending, when people use the program income that they get to buy goods at stores, how much of that goes to domestic factors of production? Like how much of that goes to payments to labor in South Africa? How much goes to payments to capital? Capital meaning profits or actual like capital expenditures. And that's kind of the first stage of the multiplier mechanism. If we wanted to get a full multiplier, we then have to say, what do those people spend money on? What do those people then buy? You know, and how does that stimulate production further down the line? We can't get there, but we can say, you know, how labor intensive are the sectors that people spend money on when they use this program, when they're part of this program. Okay, so just to jump in and get into the data. So the kind of core of the project is this data from a very large South African retailer. It's one of the largest in the country. And in particular, they've got this loyalty card program where people sign up for loyalty cards and then you get discounts when you buy stuff. And when you do that, then they record the individual and they record what you buy. And this is, you know, we're talking millions of individuals here who are part of this program. It's a very substantial share of the South African adult population. But you can't use that data to evaluate the program unless you know who in that data is part of the program or not. You know, who's a program participant, who's a teaching assistant. And so the exciting thing about this project is that we get the program participant ID numbers from Harambee, which placed a lot of the programmers, or we don't get the ID numbers, Harambee has those ID numbers. And they use this cryptographic hashing software, which comes from this company Omniscient, who then anonymize the participant IDs, right? And the Omniscient similarly anonymizes the participant IDs in the retailer data, and you can then merge the participant ID into the retailer data, and you can see who in the retail data was employed in the program and who was not. We never see their ID numbers. This company, Omniscient, never sees the ID numbers. It's all done off-site before they get a chance. They just provide this algorithm which does this cryptographic hashing. Only the original data holders ever see the ID numbers, right? But it does mean that we can see who in the data is a participant and who isn't. And we see a lot. I mean, so out of the ID numbers that we get, or the anonymous ID numbers we get, 62% are found in the retailer data. So the retailer data has got a massive reach, and it's okay. And so we have a treatment group which is made up of those matched participants, and then we have a control group. We get a 1% sample of people who are in the retailer data but are not participants. So we get a treatment and control group. Okay. There's other data sources which I'm going to have to skip due to time. Just to say that we did with Harambee also run a digital financial diary to try and get a sense of people's expenditure, which was not only at this retailer. People also spend in informal places, and people buy things other than groceries. Our retailer is mainly a grocery retailer. And we'll use a bunch of other data sets which people are probably familiar with. The one thing is we will get into this input-output data. That's going to be important. So we use stats as input-output data. Okay, again, I'm going to be very quick here. This comes from that survey that we ran with Harambee, this financial diaries data. And the key thing to just notice here is that around 50% of people's expenditures are on groceries. And if you further look at where those groceries are spent, around half of those groceries come from big chain stores, which is what our retailer is like. So our retailer, we would expect, would capture roughly 25% of people's expenditure. Then if we actually look at the retail data now, how much do participants spend at the retail firm? So before the treatment, they were spending on average, and this is an unconditional average because people don't always shop at the retailer every month, but they spend on average 327 Rand per month at the retailer. And if we look at the 437 Rand per month in the post period, and the survey was run in the post period, so our retailer captures 60% of mean grocery spending that we got in that smaller informal survey. So we think the retailer does capture a lot of people's expenditure. There are many other categories. These are just the biggest categories. And as you can see, groceries is by far the biggest category of people's expenditure at the retailer. But groceries doesn't just mean, that doesn't capture all food. There's other things like frozen and perishables, etc., which is other food expenditure. But just so you have an idea of some of the biggest categories people spend on. Okay, so to get to like the core like econometric question, which is what happens when people join this program in terms of their expenditure. So this looks complicated because we needed to account for extensive margin effects, but this is a very standard diff in diff event study. Okay, it's just using Poisson quasi-MLE to allow us to get extensive margin effects. And basically what we're doing here is we're comparing the treated group and the control group. We're looking at them before the program and after the program, and we're seeing how does expenditure change in those months for the treated group versus the control group. The one thing I'll just add is that using fixed effects, we restrict comparisons for the treated group to people who shop at the same kind of store and the same kind of location as the treated group. So we're not just comparing completely naively the treated and control group. We're trying to make sure we have people who are somewhat similar in their spending habits. And that, yeah. And the result is that it basically looks really nice. You know, the key kind of test for these things is that you have a flat pre-period. And what you see here is that it's flat before the program. As the program comes into effect, the treated group's expenditure increases dramatically compared to the control group's expenditure. That's about a 15% increase in expenditure at the retail firm. If we can look at this in a little bit more detail, for example, by this over here, this line here tells you when the program ends. That's the end of the 10-month period. And you'll see that the treated group's expenditure still remains a little bit higher than the control group's expenditure. So, or I should rather say the change is higher. And basically, that's like around a 4%, like a 15% increase during the pre-treatment period, 4% after the treatment period. And that is, you know, whether that's because people have been saving money or whether it's because, as the program intends, people have got job experience now, they can find jobs more easily, so that, you know, they've got some treatment in that way. We can't really tell. We can also look at results by what the retail firm calls departments, which are these spending categories. They're like, I think, 30 different spending categories, if I remember correctly. And, you know, you have nice, clean event studies for most of them. So the results look credible for those particular categories. But one thing to just keep in mind is that this 15% for an event study like in economics looks like a big effect. But if you think about it in terms of what the RAND increase is, it's actually not that big when you consider that people are getting 4,000 Rand a month and they're meant to be unemployed before, but their retail spending is only increasing by 15%. So it seems off a very low base. Remember, it was like 327 Rand per month before. How do we explain that? Well, one thing is that the retail store is mainly like people buy groceries from there. So here are food items, here are non-food items, and you'll see that at the retail store, there's 5 times more spending on food items than non-food items. So our estimates are highly weighted towards food items. As necessities, there's going to be a low income elasticity. Compared to other types of goods, your spending doesn't increase that much on food when you get more income. And you can see that here by looking at something like home and small appliances. There's like a 40% increase in spending from the program, whereas compared to frozen perishables, it's a 13% increase. And so you can see that in general, we have a 15% increase for these food items, we have more like a 21% increase for these non-food items, and then if you look at specific categories, you know, home and small appliances, electronics and media, you have much bigger increases in those categories. So we just need to be aware that our chain store is not fully representative of people's spending and probably be downward bias in terms of an overall effect, yeah. These categories are all incredibly strange. This comes directly from the retailer. We had no control over it. Basic softs are things like towels. I mean, it's, yeah, it's a really funny, anyway, cool. All right. Okay, so now we've got those kind of effects on spending effects at the retailer, which we regard as very well identified, very credible. The next part of the exercise is saying, where do these go? Do they go to other people's incomes? You know, this kind of first stage of the multiplier effect. To be clear, we're now going to start extrapolating, right? This is where we we don't observe the retailer's wage bill. We don't observe, how many people they employ, etc. They said they were going to give us that data, then they backtracked, so we stuck without it. And so we're going to use some other data to try and build some extrapolations here. Okay, so the first question is, when firms get a sales increase, how much do they increase employment? How much do they increase labor demand, wages, employment, something like that? We don't have an experiment or quasi-experiment for that, so we use this method in the literature, where basically we look at firms that get a particularly big increase in sales that we observe in the data. This is using this administrative data from National Treasury, which has the universe of formal sector firms in South Africa. And we see when the sales increase a lot, this orange line, how much does employment or the wage bill increase at that firm? And we're going to then use that to try and say that from that we find that when you have a 39% increase in sales, that causes, because this is kind of approximate here, a 28% increase in the wage bill. So we're going to use that to then do some actually fairly basic maths, but it looks complicated, to then say that when you have like a 7 million rand sales effect per month at the firm, which is what our estimates imply, you then expect the firm, this is that particular retail firm, to increase its monthly wage bill by about 1 million rand. That means employing more people or increasing wages. We can't really differentiate those. And similarly, using the same methodology, we find that it's also just under 1 million rand increase in capital income at the firm, which could be profits, could also be expenditures on capital goods like interest payments on machines and that kind of stuff. Okay, so we take the retail sector as a whole, and we then say, if our firm behaves as the retail sector as a whole, this is kind of what we expect. Okay, but our firm is only part of the story. What we're really interested in is that our firm, if somebody buys peanut butter, are they now going to have an increased demand for peanut butter at the firm? And then there's some manufacturer who makes peanut butter, and they're also going to increase their employment. And so what we do is we use this social accounting matrix, which basically comes from input-output data, and the part we use is basically just the input-output data. And what we say is that from the previous estimates, we can say when the firm gets its 7.5 million rand increase in sales per month, about 3.8 million comes from increased domestic retailer demands. That comes from the input-output table. That's over here. And what you see is that the retail firm, unsurprisingly, it's mainly buying goods from the manufacturing sector, a little bit from agriculture, some transport expenditures, that kind of stuff. But, the manufacturing sector gets inputs from a variety of other sectors. So, from other manufacturing firms, from agriculture, from mining, etc. We feed in the results by different, people buy basic softs, which is towels. And we say that counts as like a textile sector. Where does the textile sector fit in the input-output table? And we basically allow it all to recirculate through the input-output table. And what you find is you then get these kind of recirculation effects for each of these industries. There's a lot of double counting in here, so you have to be careful how you interpret this. You can't really interpret that number. And then we say, when we've got that, how do we get out the effect on the wage bill or capital, etc.? And we find that over and above the effect at the firm, which was like an increase in the wage bill of 1 million rand, capital around 1 million rand per month, through these other industries, there's an increase in the monthly wage bill of around 1.7 million rand, and in capital incomes about 1.8. Okay, so you get, basically when you account for the fact that this money is going to recirculate through the economy, and you buy intermediate goods, that you kind of more than double the wage bill effect. Okay, this is the, okay, but that's basically, so out of the 7.5 million effect at the firm, you basically have 72% of that is going to wage bill or incomes. It's not 100% because some of people, they buy things from imports, there are price increases which don't translate. But one thing to note is that this capital income is income to the company. Some of that will be repatriated overseas. So the capital income you can't think of as all just South African domestic income. Okay, right. This is the last exercise that we do. Basically, what's the second last exercise? But I'll be quick. No, it's the last exercise. Okay. Basically, we only were looking before at the expenditure at our retail firm, but obviously our retail firm doesn't capture all of people's spending. So what we could do here is something which is like a little bit dodgy, and we just scale up all our estimates by the amount of income that people receive that is not at the retail firm. There's like huge assumptions in here because we know people actually spend stuff on like transport, and we're assuming that there's the same value chain in transport as there is in retail. But basically, if you just scale it up, what you find is that there's a direct spending effect of around 53 million, which again is probably lower than it is in reality, because remember, our retail store has focused on food items, necessities, which have a lower elasticity of income. And that would then mean you would have around 90 million rand per month going directly to incomes. This is even more speculative. One can say that you try and isolate like local incomes by looking at where you think what kind of employment is likely to be local. We say 13.3 million per month to local incomes, and one can basically just apply the estimates to national grants to create an even bigger estimate if you want. And basically the way we think about this is we start off with something which we think is very credible, the effects at the firms, and then we kind of build in additional assumptions and additional data to get at effects outside the firms. You know, there's real limitations, especially to that extrapolation exercise. But we kind of think it's a good starting point for thinking about how much of that income goes to labor versus capital, et cetera. And the important thing is this extrapolation part does not use the retail data. Other people, if they want, they have their own model. They can use our retail estimates, and they can then build in their own model of the macroeconomy. And the last thing is to just say that, you know, we think these potential multiplier effects are important, but they aren't the only benefits of the program. We don't look at things like, you know, that they provide a service of schools. And obviously, if you look at those consumption results, people spending a lot on, you know, medical goods or pharmacy goods, you know, people buying necessities is obviously a good thing in itself. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I think it's amazing how digital access is creating new opportunities for insights from data, and we're really looking forward to the further extrapolations from the kind of data that's been available. So thank you, Josh. We're going to move on to Tim KÖHLER. This study also supported by AFD. Can cash transfers to the unemployed support economic activity? And there's evidence to this effect. So over to you, Tim.
Thanks, Kate. See if this works. Yeah, there you go. Very nice. All right, hi everyone. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So my name's Tim. I'm a junior research fellow and PhD candidate at the DPRU at UCT. And this is joint work with my colleagues Haroon and David de Villiers. I believe Haroon is obviously here. David, I don't think could make it. And of course, as Kate mentioned, this was work commissioned and supported by the AFD as well as the EU Commission and the EU delegation in South Africa and the South African presidency. So we're very grateful for their support. And yes, still largely work in progress. So if you have any feedback, I know there are a couple of people in the room who've already given us fantastic feedback. Hopefully we've incorporated that in by this point. Apologies if not. But if anyone else has any feedback, we'd greatly appreciate it. So to set the research in a broader context, the age-old question in the literature is, what is the relationship between receipt of an unconditional cash transfer and behavior within the labor market? When we consider the discourse with respect to various stakeholders in an economy, it's very often negative, right? There's the widely held conception that receipt of cash transfers discourage participation in labor markets or disincentivize individuals into finding a job, for instance. But when we consider the economic theory, it's largely ambiguous, and it can suggest either positive or negative effects. So when turning to the empirical evidence, somewhat unfortunately, it's also mixed. The literature documents both positive and negative effects on labor supply and conditional on supplying one's labor various intensive margin labor market outcomes. But what the literature does highlight very often is that the labor market effects of these programs often very much depend on two characteristics of an economy in particular. The first is the design of the program itself, and the second is the underlying economic conditions of a given context. So we sort of use this sort of characteristic, so to speak, to frame our question as, well, what if the cash transfer in itself focuses what if both 1 and 2, these two components, focus explicitly on unemployment? So in this sense, the SRD in South Africa provides for a useful sort of case study, at least in our opinion. UCT here doesn't stand for University of Cape Town, it stands for an unconditional cash transfer. I realize that's probably not the ideal acronym. And SRD here is the grant in question. So I'm pretty certain everyone here in the room is familiar with the South African context, but for those of you who aren't, South Africa is obviously plagued with structural and persistent unemployment exceeding 30% for the last few years, and has generally been very high for the whole post-apartheid period. And the new cash transfer, the Social Relief of Distress Grant, or the SRD for short, was the first transfer in the country to explicitly target the unemployed. So arguably, one might consider it as a sort of labor market vulnerability transfer. But importantly, if possible, I'd like us to keep this in mind throughout the presentation, is that the grant wasn't explicitly designed to influence labor market behavior. Its primary purpose was simply, in response to the pandemic, to provide a source of income relief to individuals who couldn't access any source of income otherwise. So simply put, in this paper, we try and estimate the labor market effects of receipt of this new transfer in South Africa. We do so by first exploiting a proxy variable within the data, which we believe plausibly indirectly identifies recipients. And second, we run a simple diff and diff model. I say simple, but it's one of the new estimators in the new literature. And I'm very happy that Josh, even if briefly, explained the approach, because the methodologies, at least at their core, are equivalent. So hopefully I can save some time there. We focus on 3 outcomes in particular. The first is the probability of looking for work. The second is the probability of trying to start a business. That's simply a consequence of how the question is framed in the survey. So we can't observe whether someone actually starts a business. It's simply if they answered affirmatively to trying to start a business. And the third is actually finding a job. We estimate effects on average, but we also focus on various sources of heterogeneity, how these effects vary, for instance, by employment type, whether an individual begins wage work or working for someone for pay as opposed to becoming self-employed, for example, by employment formality, informal or formal sector, as well as, for instance, receipt duration, which is, for example, how do effects vary, if any, based on if an individual received the grant just for 1 quarter. Our data is quarterly, so we can only observe, that's the frequency of the data, as opposed to a full year of receipt. And just examining the literature, we do expect some notable heterogeneity there. I'll be brief on this. For those who are, again, somewhat unfamiliar with the South African context, prior to the pandemic, South Africa had a relatively comprehensive social assistance system, with most cash transfers in the system being unconditional in nature, being means tested, so that means they're relatively progressive, and they largely target children, the elderly, and the disabled or differently abled in poor households. So given this description, there's a well-documented hole in the social assistance net that is a limited or no amount of support for working-aged, able-bodied individuals in the system. Some have argued that this is because of an assumption that these individuals would be able to support themselves by gaining income through the labor market. This, of course, ignores the persistent and structural nature of unemployment that characterizes the economy. So in response to the pandemic, the SRD partially, at least, addressed this gap. The grant is equivalent to about 350 Rand per person per month, which is about $50 in PPP terms. It's relatively small in size, not only with respect to existing grants in the system, but even with respect to wages in the labor market, about 7 or 8% of the wage in the middle of the distribution. So relatively small, and one might expect it then to not necessarily act as a disincentive to engage in labor market activity. It explicitly, again, targets unemployed adults without any other means of support, so that includes other existing cash transfers or benefits from the Unemployment Insurance Fund. It was intended to be temporary for a period of 6 months from April 2020, but has experienced several extensions since, the latest of which being about a week ago in the medium-term budget. So it's currently still in place today, at least until 2025, elections pending. And yeah, importantly, the grant brought millions of previously unreached and vulnerable individuals into the system in a relatively quick amount of time, despite some delays. I won't spend too much time here, but the SRD is represented by the red bars here. And by the end of 2020, the grant brought in about 6 million previously unreached people, which far exceeds the growth of the entire system in the decade preceding the pandemic. Yeah. So the data we use comes from the National Statistics Office, Stats SA's QLFS, or Quarterly Labor Force Survey. We use 5 waves of data for the whole of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021. Reason being is because of a consequence of the pandemic, this period allows us to track the majority of individuals surveyed in this period within each quarter over time, which is something that can't usually be done with such a large sample in the country. So as a consequence of the pandemic, the QLFS became an unbalanced panel survey, which we believe has much scope to be further exploited in future research. The survey is at the individual level, it's a household survey, it's nationally representative, and of course the panel component is important, particularly for our purposes here, because we want to try and estimate, again, how effects vary by duration of receipt. And in order to do that, we need to be able to observe the same person for at least a year, for instance. We end up with a sample of just over 50,000 observations. This sample is restricted to those who are unemployed, within working age, and don't receive any of the other government benefits, such as existing alternative cash transfers or benefits from the UIF. Reason being is this is just a way for us to try and get at avoiding any sort of confounding bias from alternative policies that were also introduced around about the same time. Yes. So identification, how do we estimate a causal effect? Again, a difference in difference model, a staggered one in particular. It's referred to as staggered for those who are unfamiliar just because the timing of treatment, so to speak, occurs at different points in time for different individuals. Even though the grant was rolled out in April 2020, or it started being paid out at the end of May, everyone who received the grant didn't start receiving it from May. Some people only applied later on in the year, some people earlier, etc. And there's a large literature, which I'll touch on later, which empirically shows that if you don't account for the staggered nature of treatment, conventional difference in difference estimates will be severely biased. Again, focusing on the 3 outcomes. I think I touched on this before, but in the QLFS, there's no question which asks directly about, do you receive the SRD grant or not? There are for other cash transfers, but not this one. It still hasn't been changed to date. However, we argue that by a process of elimination and by using other questions within the questionnaire that does ask about receipt of other cash transfers, like the child support grant or the old age pension, we observe there's this other question that asks, well, do you receive any other welfare grants? Not listed here. By a simple process of elimination and a comparison to administrative data, this huge uptick here that we see, not prior to the introduction of the grant, but thereafter, arguably can only be explained by the SRD coming into the system. So we use this variable again to indirectly identify recipients in the data. And by comparing the characteristics of those recipients to another survey which did ask a direct question about SRD recipients, those characteristics are very similar. So we believe our proxy variable is quite sufficient. Again, we used a staggered difference in difference estimator to account for that sort of bias that is introduced in conventional difference in difference approaches when you have multiple periods, i.e. more than 2 time periods, but more specifically when treatment is staggered in nature. I won't go into this into too much detail here, but for anyone, just for the sake of time and potential variation in expertise, but for anyone who's interested in talking about this more, happy to. It's a large and still evolving literature. But we adopt this particular estimator by Callaway and Santana. It's semi-parametric and doubly robust in nature, and it has a number of advantages that, with more time, I would love to speak about. Yes, so moving on. Jumping right into the results. So again, recall that we focus on those 3 outcomes in particular. Focusing on the doubly robust estimates, we do not find any evidence of any effect of receipt of the grant on the probability of looking for work. We find a small but only marginally significant positive effect of receipt of the grant on the probability of trying to start a business. And notably, we find a highly significant, larger, but still by magnitude small effect on the probability of actually finding work. That's about 3 percentage points there. And importantly, for all the effects that we do find on employment, we find that these effects, so this is an average effect here, the effect tends to be larger in magnitude for individuals who first received the grant towards the end of 2020, which comforts us somewhat with respect to policies that were introduced around about the same time that the SRD was introduced in the second quarter of 2020. So just want to keep that in mind. When we interrogate these positive employment effects further, we find that the employment effect is explained by wage employment as opposed to different types of employment, like the probability of becoming an employer or becoming self-employed or an unpaid household worker. There it is there. We don't really find any evidence on the probability of becoming an employer. A very small and only marginally significant effect on the probability of being self-employed, and no effect on becoming an unpaid household worker. Again, effects are larger in magnitude towards the end of the year, again, when the economy was more open, of course, beyond the initial restrictions. And again, we find that these employment effects are rather explained by positive effects in the formal sector as opposed to the informal sector, at least on average. Again, these effects are larger towards the end of 2020. When we consider informal sector employment effects, we do, however, observe a smaller, but still positive and significant at the 5% level effect on informal sector employment at the end of for individuals who first received the grant at the end of 2020, but in no other period. So it seems like these employment effects are dominated by the formal sector as opposed to the informal sector. Event study estimates. Thanks, Josh. Won't explain these in too much detail, but again, regardless of outcome, our pre-trends look pretty flat. And again, the explicit assumption based on the approach that we're using is that in the absence of the introduction of the grant, we would expect these zero effects to continue. That's not what we see particularly for one outcome here. So focusing on the red coefficients, which is for employment, we again find that in the short term, after one additional quarter of receipt of the grant, we find a positive and relatively larger, at least compared to the average effect on employment of nearly 10 percentage points. So that's in the short term, but importantly, with additional periods of receipt, that coefficient becomes zero and possibly, well, it is in negative territory after a full year of receipt. So that implies that the grant may be particularly, perhaps more useful in the short term, but the labor market benefits, at least in our data and in our sample here, don't necessarily materialize with longer periods of receipt. Yes, and these dynamics are very similar when we consider, again, what type of employment that an individual finds. So again, effects are, driven by effects on wage employment, and again, on formal sector employment. However, in our event studies here, we do pick up additionally, again, a smaller but still positive effect on informal sector employment as well. But regardless of sector formality, both effects decrease to zero after a full year of receipt. We've considered, one can consider the literature and consider various mechanisms to explain this effect. The one particular mechanism we're interested in is how do we explain the fact that it seems like this suggests the grant increased the probability of employment without increasing the likelihood that someone looks for employment. So one particular mechanism we're interested in is that measure of job search is, of course, on the extensive margin, i.e. not looking for work versus looking for work. But what about conditional and already looking for work? It's plausible that the grant, that receipt of the grant changes the behavior or the way that an individual looks for work. And we find some evidence, some preliminary estimates that does support this hypothesis, with no one seemingly being dominant. So basically, we re-estimate the specification and we just change the outcome variable based on a question which asked individuals who were looking for work, how did they look for work? And we find evidence that basically suggests that receipt of the grant increases the likelihood that an individual, for instance, seeks financial assistance from relatives or friends to look for work, waited on the street as a casual worker, looked for assets or applied for a permit to start a business, sought assistance from their social network, etc. We don't find any evidence that the grant increased the likelihood of them registering at an employment agency or placed or answered job placement ads. But overall, it seems like there may be multiple mechanisms which explain how individuals conditional and already looking for work, how the grant helped them successfully get a job. And we do various robustness tests, which I'll skip for the sake of time. But yes, overall, so again, framing our study, we consider how the labor market effects of cash transfer programs often vary by the underlying economic conditions, as well as the design of the program itself. And what we want to focus on here is, well, what if both of those things explicitly focus on unemployment? Our main findings, again, are we find no evidence of any effect on job search, at least on the extensive margin. We do find a positive effect on employment, but only in the short term, driven by wage and formal sector employment. However, this effect reduces to zero and possibly even negative in the longer term. We explore some possible mechanisms which suggest that these effects can be explained by some intensive margin adjustments to job search behavior. And there are a number of next steps we'd like to take. For instance, exploring how receipt of the grant affects the behavior of co-residents within the same household who don't receive the grant. And there are a number of additional robustness tests we'd like to do, which I'm happy to talk about later if need be. Necessary disclaimers. This is a partial equilibrium analysis. Doesn't necessarily provide evidence of how these labor market effects trickle up to the macroeconomy. And there are, of course, the usual host of broader macroeconomic concerns that need to be taken into account that we don't address here. All right, thanks very much.
Thanks so much. So, many questions. I certainly have many from both Josh's paper and Tim's, but we're going to move through all the presentations and hold the questions for the end. So please jot them down, note them down. We're going to move on now to Robert Hill, who is talking about the effect of wage subsidies on job retention in a developing country, which is South Africa. And this is another program that was introduced as part of the response to the pandemic. The TERS program, which I can remember the temporary employment part of the acronym, and I'm sure Robert will give us the rest.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's quite a tongue twister. The Temporary Employer-Employee Relief Scheme. TERS is much easier to say. So yes, luckily one of the good things that I can say is having co-authors in the room means that a lot of the contextual building up has been done already. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is basically this program that was introduced as a support mechanism during the COVID-19 pandemic, and arguably as a wage subsidy, although there's a little bit of contention as to whether we think it's a wage subsidy or something else. We believe that it probably is best defined as a wage subsidy, and that's how we're going to be positioning this paper. Great. So one thing that we do know is during the COVID-19 lockdowns around the world that active labor market policies were particularly important in terms of trying to support employment outcomes and saving jobs around the world. And wage subsidies were particularly important, and they were particularly prevalent during the pandemic. And we see the TERS policy as acting as a type of wage subsidy, where there was some kind of transfer made to employers that was then used to sort of either top up or support the wages that they were paying to their employees. Some people might argue slightly differently, but a lot of debate between us and our office has gone on, and this is where we feel the definition fits most comfortably. For example, just to emphasize how important these things are, by January 2022, 60% of countries had introduced some form of wage subsidy as a support mechanism during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in South Africa, our Temporary Employer-Employee Relief Scheme, TERS, I did put it in the slide, I'm proud of myself. It was essentially a wage subsidy that was financed through our unemployment insurance program, or our unemployment insurance fund, the UIF. So it was financed through the UIF surplus, and this is the sort of mechanism that this subsidy was rolled out into the labor market. TERS, essentially what it tried to do is it aimed to prevent retrenchments amongst the employed by providing wage support to employers who either fully or partially closed their operations during our lockdown, which kicked in just at the end of March 2020. The TERS program itself ran from April 2020, which was just after we went into lockdown, and it ran up until July 2021. It was not one cohesive policy that had the same rules the whole time. It had various changes in eligibility and various changes in who could claim and all of those sorts of things over time. But in its entirety, the TERS reached about 5.7 million individual workers, and it paid out nearly 64 billion rand, which in terms of PPP terms is approximately 9 billion US dollars. So it was not a trivial support mechanism. It was quite a large support mechanism that reached an awful lot of people in the South African economy over its sort of year and a little bit tenure. This is a picture. I thought rather than giving you lots of words, I was going to give you a picture as to how the TERS works, because pictures speak 1,000 words, and this is quite a long working paper, and I've got my work cut out for me to summarize it into 15 minutes. So what we've got here, the TERS amount, or the amount that you could claim from the TERS, was calculated according to what we call the income replacement rate. Now, that income replacement rate, this IRR, you can see here it's laid out in the UIF schedule in the law. You can work out what your income replacement rate would be. It's varying percentages that decrease as your monthly wage increases. What would happen is, for example, if you were to imagine, okay, you've got a monthly wage of, say, 4,000 Rand, you might end up with a replacement rate of just under 50%. That means that in theory, the TERS benefit that you would be eligible for would be plus minus 2,000 Rand. But we had a limit where we said, okay, well, actually, if your calculated TERS benefit lies below 3,500 Rand, which is the equivalent of the national minimum wage, you get topped up so that the minimum take-home pay that you have is 3,500 Rand. Now, this over here, if you think about it, you could think about this graph as showing exactly how much you could take home from TERS if your employer wasn't contributing anything. If your employer contributed some amount of money, so you were getting your 4,000 Rand and your TERS benefit should have been 2,000 Rand, now TERS will pay you 3,500. If your employer was contributing 1,000 Rand towards your wages during that time because you only partially closed down, you would still only take home 3,500 Rand. What that would mean is that your employer is contributing 1,000, but actually then you've got 2,500 Rand coming from the TERS subsidy itself. So this, what we say minimum benefit of 3,500 Rand, that is your minimum take-home pay. There's also a maximum. You couldn't get more than 6,730 Rand out of the TERS. That equates to about maxing out at a salary of about 17,000 Rand a month. So you wouldn't be able to claim more than, say, 6,730 Rand, more or less, with a couple of cents, out of the TERS program. That is the maximum subsidy that would have been provided to you. So this is more or less how the TERS subsidy would work and what the bounds of the subsidy were. I'm going to jump straight into the data and method to explain to you what we decided to do, because what was useful about the sort of idiosyncrasies of how the eligibility of TERS changed is that at the end of May 2020, there was a pretty substantial eligibility change. That was before the end of May 2020. So for the first 2 months of the TERS, only UIF contributing workers were eligible to claim TERS. This means that only those people who were actually contributing to South Africa's unemployment insurance program were allowed to claim from this temporary relief scheme. Obviously, you can understand why there might have been uproar about this, and the eligibility criteria changed after that. So after the end of May 2020, TERS became available to everyone. Now, this sounds like any kind of econometrician's dream, right? Because this is an exogenous change in eligibility, which you can obviously then use to try and calculate, well, you know, it's something exogenous. What is the effect of this sort of natural experiment on outcomes? So that's exactly what we did, right? The change in the eligibility criterion allows us to consider job retention effects of the TERS. So did TERS help you keep your job or not? And we could compare this between people who were eligible and ineligible. And we could say, right, well, if you were contributing to UIF, did you have a better chance of keeping your job or not compared to people who were not contributing to the UIF? We also note that the nature of the TERS subsidy changes across the wage distribution, as we saw in the graph, like how much you can claim from TERS is different depending on whether you're earning a lot or whether you're earning a little. And so we know that higher earners get larger absolute subsidy amounts, although this does it does mean proportionally they're probably getting a lower proportion of their wage subsidized. This raises the question, did TERS maybe have heterogeneous effects across the wage distribution? In other words, did a bigger subsidy being given to somebody actually lead to a slightly different effect? Do we see people with larger subsidies seeing larger job retention effects or something like that? And we can investigate this a little bit as well. So Tim has done a very good job of going through the data, so I'll whiz through this. But we make use, again, of the quarterly labor force survey, which is South Africa's sort of standard labor market statistics repository. It's where we get all of our data from regarding the labor market. And as Tim mentioned, due to the pandemic, the KÖHLER became an unbalanced longitudinal survey. And in particular for us, between Q1 and Q2 of 2020, what's really useful is that we could see 71% of our sample repeated. This allowed us to essentially use a panel element here to track people and check their employment over time. It did require a little bit of finagling because the QLFS is not designed as a panel. It's normally designed as some kind of rotational panel and normally only for cross-sectional purposes. And so we made use of household and personal identifiers plus age, sex, and race to identify individuals across time. We want to know whether there was a job retention effect. So what we've got to do is we've got to restrict our sample to those who are employed in the first quarter. So we wanted people to be employed before the lockdown hit. And we wanted to say, well, what happened to them after the lockdown was in place? So we restrict our sample to only those people who were employed in Q1, but we allowed them to be any employment status in Q2. This resulted in a balanced panel of about 10,000 individuals that we observe over time. And we do a whole bunch of tests where we see that our balanced panel seems relatively representative of the broader population after testing for differences in observed covariates. We'll also investigate effects across the wage distribution, and we correct for outliers and use multiple imputation to account for missing wage data. So we make use of this change in the TERS eligibility criteria that I've mentioned. The problem is that the QLFS doesn't include information on receipt of TERS. It includes information on eligibility because it includes information about whether you were contributing to UIF or not. So using eligibility is not necessarily a problem, but it does require some rescaling. So a whole bunch of other literature has used eligibility as a kind of proxy to work out the effect of policies. But what we can do is, using some more recent literature, we can transform our results on eligibility to results on receipt, making use of some kind of relative probability of receipt given eligibility. So we restrict our sample to our employees in the formal private sector, which is about 62% of total employment. Our dependent variable is binary. It is a job retention dummy, where it is 1 if the individual status went from employed to employed across the 2 quarters, and it's 0 if they went from employed to any other employment status. This is our model of interest. Again, it's a diff and diff. It's basically a 2-way fixed effects model, if you want to think about it across time with individual characteristics as well. Our coefficient of interest is this gamma over here, where we've interacted a dummy for whether the person was eligible for TERS or not, with a time dummy for whether they were in the post-lockdown period or not. To test model heterogeneity, to model the heterogeneity of the TERS effects, what we then do is we also include an interaction here with a wage or subsidy polynomial. So that'll allow us to check whether there were different effects for different people on the different parts of the wage distribution. Right, so our results. Basically, I think this is the good news. What we see here is that in our difference in difference estimate, we see always, no matter what type of model we use, whether we're including demographic controls, labor market controls, individual fixed effects, whatever they might be, we see positive and strong effects of the TERS on job retention. These positive, strong effects are robust to a whole bunch of different things. We checked for the expanded ETI because we know that the ETI was expanded at the same time, so we control for that. We still see a positive effect of TERS. We went and we checked whether, we did a placebo test for 2019 data and we saw no effect. So we know that this over here must be something to do with this particular data. We suspect that this must then be because of the TERS, because a whole battery of different robustness tests that we throw at this still leaves us with effects of between 11% and 17% percentage points increase in job retention probability for those who were TERS eligible relative to those who are not. Of course, this is at the mean, and it's also for eligibility. So because not all eligible workers receive the TERS, it understates the effect of the TERS. So we can, basically using a bit of a mathematical manipulation from these papers, we can adjust our effect to account for receipt. And what we find is that the effect here, our receipt is 0.33. That is the estimate, which we interpret as approximately 33.2% of workers who received the TERS would not have remained employed in the absence of the policy. So that does also raise a slight flag. 66.8% of workers who they would have remained employed. So there is an inframarginal effect, but it's quite important, I think, to see that 33.2% of workers who received the TERS would have lost their jobs if the TERS were not in place. And I think that's a very big, important impact. We do see across the wage distribution very quickly that we do have slightly regressive effects of the TERS. Higher wage workers seem to have benefited more than low wage workers, which is maybe not ideal. However, we do note that all of the effects are still positive across the distribution. So yes, maybe higher wages and higher wage earners benefited slightly more, but not that much more. You know, and plus what we see is also everybody did benefit. So that is also good news. All right, and then just to conclude, there are some key findings that I think are useful to take away to be the bearer of good news rather than anything else. The first thing is TERS increase the probability of remaining employed in the short term by approximately 16 percentage points. And that's really nice. Unfortunately, we can't go any further than this because of the eligibility criterion changing and not having data on TERS in, say, the QLFS. But at least in the short term, we've got very good news. After adjusting for receipt, we find that TERS saved, if you account for, you know, if you change that 33% into a number, it's approximately 2.7 million jobs that we estimate TERS saved, which is a pretty big number. Although we don't want to compare that with the estimates of how many jobs were lost, you know, from the QLFS, because we worry about, you know, our number being a gross number, the QLFS being net, all sorts of other things there. According to the cost of the TERS, it cost approximately 13,000 Rand per job saved, and it compares fairly favorably to more developed contexts. And the job saving effects remain positive across the entire wage distribution, even if the effects are slightly regressively distributed. So hopefully, you know, that is some good news about the impact that TERS had on job retention over time. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much. More of interest to interrogate there. What's also interesting, actually, is that, you know, really there were quite a wide range of interventions in response to the pandemic when one stops and reflects on all these different components of the economic recovery interventions. Last but not least, we have Kelly ARDINGTON, who's going to take us in a slightly different direction. Her paper is entitled Harnessing Community Resources to Enhance Learning, and it certainly has implications for the Presidential Employment Stimulus's largest program, the 250,000 young people employed as teachers' assistants. This work has been really important for us in informing elements of strategy. So over to you, Kelly.
Yeah, does this work?
This one.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I think this feels like quite a serious change in direction. I'm used to presenting this work at education conferences, which is very much the viewpoint. It's usually about reflecting on the potential to grab budget from outside of education to improve educational outcomes. But here today, really, the focus is on how we can use evidence that we can improve educational outcomes to motivate the continuation of something that started as part of a COVID recovery program, that we can motivate that beyond just youth employment, that there is potential to also positively impact educational outcomes. So there's going to be some stuff on the BYE, PYER, BER, which Josh has already covered. But just in case, for those of you not sort of in the education space, just to give a little bit of context. So South Africa has a learning crisis which is echoed across the continent and actually in much of the world, where we've got everyone in school, but learning outcomes are really poor. The figures that I'm showing here are from a national assessment called PEARLS, which assesses reading and comprehension. And South Africa in 2006, 87% of our 4-year-olds were not reaching the low international benchmark, which means that they cannot retrieve explicitly stated facts from text in any language, home language, or in most cases, English. And what we see off this very low base, there has been improvement, but then COVID, we've kind of lost a decade of improvement. So we have, nothing short of an educational crisis. I can show you similar results for mathematics, looks as daunting. And obviously there are lots of reasons behind this, but we have slow pace, poor curriculum coverage. We have a tradition of very communalized education with very little opportunity for individualized feedback. And a lot of this, not the only reason, but it's certainly exacerbated by the fact that we have very large class sizes. So this is showing amongst foundation phase learners, so in the grades 1 to 3, the number of learners in a class. And in the province that I'm going to be looking at is in Limpopo, you can see that 27% are in classes of more than 50 learners. And imagine a room. Imagine you were all grade 1s and I'm the teacher, and spare a thought. So the thing is, this figure is actually fairly old, but recent stuff from like 2019 only suggests that this has got actually much worse over time. And in context of which there are many, where we've got these poor learning outcomes, these big classes, people have started to turn to, and with success, youth volunteers in India, in Ghana, there's a big program using a government youth employment program. Okay, now I'm back in your guys' territory. So, we know there's huge unemployment, particularly very high youth unemployment, and I think maybe the more useful way to think about it is the NEAT framework, where we've got over a third of 15 to 24-year-olds and all the way up to half of 25 to 35-year-olds who are not in training, they're not in education, and they're not employed. And this is from Harambee. It's showing a youth employment density. I'm not exactly sure what they are, but they're youth job opportunities. But the key point is the gray areas, they're kind of calling job deserts. There's just absolutely nothing going on there. And we will return to that picture a bit later. Okay, so what I've been doing in the education space got to do with this? We've been working with an NGO called Fundawanda, which focuses on foundational literacy and numeracy. And we've been working across 3 different provinces. And so there's a sort of core set of learner and teacher support materials, and then these different modalities of support. So in the Eastern Cape, we work with coaches. They work with coaches. In the Western Cape, it's a whole province-wide thing, working with the subject advisors. And in Limpopo, which remember that's where the very big class sizes are, we've got 2 arms, but one of them is working with teacher assistants. So within that, we conducted an RCT amongst 120 schools. So we had a control arm, and then an arm that got the core set of materials, and then another arm that got the core set of materials, but that every teacher in foundation phase got their own teacher assistant in the classroom for the whole year. And then we've been following, we've just now come out of field for the third round, but we're following 20 learners in each of grade R and 1 in those schools. Okay, so the Fundawanda program has kind of identified, so this identification actually comes from the program itself. What they've identified as the 4 key pillars of their program that have, I'll show you later, it has been highly successful. What lies behind that success? And the first thing was a very rigorous recruitment and selection process. So they went around this, they used an online thing, they worked with Harambee, and they had an online where they got 1,200 applications. Those were weeded down to about 250, and then they had a day with all these stations doing literacy, numeracy, one of Harambee's soft skills, and various things. And then from that, they selected the final group of TAs for the first year, and then obviously they've done similar things each year. The second thing is that the program is embedded in this structured Fundawanda program. So it's not like the teacher assistants just go to these schools. They get trained on the same materials the teachers are getting trained on. They have a very clear mandate of what to do each day. They get continuous support from mentors on a ratio of 30:1, which I think is quite crucial. And then they get 4 days of training each term. Well, they got an onboarding training, and then each term they get 4 days of training. So, and then, as I said, they're provided to the teacher. I want to come back at the end to each of these and what these mean for taking things to scale. Oops, wrong way. Okay. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but these are the results. So on the left here, this is the materials only arm, and then this is the materials plus the TA. And we're really looking at 2 things, literacy and numeracy. Basic summary is there are positive effects in both, but almost double the size of the effects when you add the teacher assistant. And what we're seeing here, there's just a range of, reading is a complex hierarchical process. It's just showing we're getting effects across the range from the letter sounds all the way to comprehension. The other thing, we've recently developed benchmarks for reading in every South African language. These changes are meaningful because the problem is often these things, the kids were reading at an average of 2 words per minute. It goes to 4 minutes per minute. That's a huge increase, but they still can't read for meaning. What's pleasing here, we're getting the kids moving to the benchmark from 18% to 35%. So still a long ways to go, but the movements are actually educationally meaningful. And so the yellow line is the TA, not the yellow, orange. Other than at the very bottom, we're seeing kind of improvements across the distribution. And then very quickly, this is the numeracy stuff, very similar picture. Positive on both sides, almost double the effect when you had the TAs. Again, I'm not going to show, but if you look at specific things like addition or whatever, they're meaningful improvements, and they also tend to be across the distribution. From a quantitative point of view, we don't have a lot of things about mechanisms, but one of the things we do is a book audit. And if we just look at the average number of pages that have been filled in learner workbooks, it's much higher in the materials arm, and then even higher still in the treatment arm. We have done, and we're doing a whole lot more qualitative work to unpack that more. I think I'll skip over that. Okay, so I can probably skip this slide too, thanks to Josh. So this is I want to take you, this is the figure that you saw earlier. These aren't on the same scale, but that's not really the point. This is showing the location of where people were placed in the 2021 BER schools. And basically, it doesn't really matter about the scale, but you can see what this program is doing is it's highly spatially equitable, both from a youth employment point of view and from an educational point of view. And then, it's reaching the most remote, the most disadvantaged communities, but it also can do that quickly and at scale. So sort of this whole schooling system allows you just to achieve that. So when we actually started this program, and then we found out COVID happened, and then suddenly there was this BER, we were like, total panic, because now we were doing this teacher assistant thing, and now there's these educator assistants, and it was a little bit panicky and scary, but in the end, it's actually been really good to have these two processes, that you've had this big rollout of this government program, but that we've had this smaller rollout where we've really been able to start to get proof of concept of how you can implement a program like that, and at the same time achieve improve educational outcomes. So, often you have one or the other. You do the bottom job, but then you've still got the thing of like, can you actually scale this? Will SUD2 be happy with it? Is it like organizationally feasible to do it on scale, and so on? So it's quite nice to land up with both of these pieces of information together at one point. Yep. So just to come back to the four kind of pillars that the organization itself has identified to crucial to this program, and to think through for each of these how feasible it is to go from this tiny little, couple of schools to scale, and how that might or might not be able to fit in to these youth employment type programs. So the first is the rigorous selection, and unfortunately I thought I was going to get one of those, when you get the notes. I can't remember the numbers, but in the last round, the fourth round of the PYEI, I think there were something like 1.2 million applications for. So certainly in terms of, unfortunately, we've got a lot of unemployed youth. It's maybe not the case everywhere. So in the sort of more rural areas, it might be harder to find enough good candidates who are close to schools, but certainly on aggregate, there are going to be many more applicants than their places. So that's not really, I think, the tricky part. And Harambee have developed ways of quickly screening and doing kind of online things. So I think that's achievable. Then the high quality learner and teacher materials, that as well. I mean, a lot of this stuff is open source, the Fundawanda, but there are many other organizations. There's a commitment from DBE of having a basic package. So I think we can it's not trivial, but we can kind of tick that box. The continuous support, the mentors on that ratio of 30:1 were important. So one needs to think carefully about that, but there is subject advisors, head teachers, they're models that can do that. So I think the real tough one is the training. So we had an onboarding, 4 days of training each term. And that's the sort of really tricky piece to think how one does this at scale. And obviously the cost, it's not just a cost thing, but it's also like, is there enough capacity to run such training, at a very large scale? But I think without getting that piece right, it's very unlikely that you're actually going to do this sort of the hitting two birds with one stone, both having a youth employment, promoting youth employment and attachment to the labor force, and then at the same time actually, seeing an increase in educational outcomes. So have I got any time left? Tiny, okay. So just to say like where this has kind of gone from here, it's been really nice to see this information being fed into a process with Kate and others, and what's currently being trialed is something very, focusing on just grade 1, just looking at learners' letter sounds. Like 50% of South African learners do not know all 26 letter sounds at the end of grade 1. So it's a sort of 3-month, so the training is easy, short, the materials are very focused, and trying to sort of, and also working across a range of NGOs, so NGO agnostic, and really trying to sort of iterate to see if we can continue this proof of concept thing and then use it as a motivation to say, yes, this may have been a one-off COVID thing, but if actually we can also improve education outcomes, there's a real motivation for continuing this.
Thanks so much. So, as many in the room know, right now we are in the throes of policy debate over the future of this program. It has employed 250,000 young people every year since COVID, and with every phase we've been able to intensify the impacts. You've seen the spatial distribution. There's nothing that provides youth unemployment with that level of equity. There's no youth employment program remotely at the scale. The next biggest contender, the Youth Employment Service, employs 40,000 a year, places 40,000 a year compared to the 250,000 a year here. But the really exciting part has been how over time we are starting to see real results on the program being able to move the dial on learning outcomes. There's a lot in play in this space. DBE has really embraced the Fundawandi research, is really looking at how do we embed those lessons at scale. And there's even discussion at the moment about how you could take 1 in 30 from, say, this year's cohort, keep them in the next year and train them as mentors, as ways of addressing this issue of how do you provide the support on an ongoing basis. So I hope you are all as enthusiastic as I am on the need for this program to continue. And on that note, I'll hand over to the discussant. Where is Haroon? I saw him come in. Haroon, over to you, and then we'll open for conversation.
Okay. So I had comments prepared, and then I redid them as I was listening to all the presentations. But it struck me in trying to connect the presentations, Scott Cunningham, who's known to many in the room, the sort of econometrician, he's got the sticker, the bumper sticker, right, which says, "I love federalism," because it allows you to do all these natural experiments. And that's what everybody essentially has done, with, I guess, the RCT being one exception. But the nice thing about that is that it's credible, big tick. It's PhDable, big tick, right? So you've got all the young guns, all the tools come out, and it's wonderful, actually. And you've got great data. So for me, the question then is, instead of sort of quibbling with estimation technique or extensions and so on, is to think about, okay, well, what are some of the bigger picture questions that we could pose that connect across all the 4 papers? And I think that was the role we were given as discussant, rather than actually, thankfully, discussing every single paper. So I thought there were 3 big themes for me. One is micro-macro linkages. The second is actually a lead from that, is thinking of subgroup interventions. And then finally, sort of hodgepodge of ideas around individuals, households, and firms. And as I look around the room, some of you have heard me say this before. So on micro-macro linkages, I'm being deliberately I'm overstating the case in each of the papers, but I think it's generally true. If we go through each of them, and if I just take the SRD, there's a micro-macro discussion to be had. I'm not going to go to the fiscal deficit and whether it's affordable, whether there's a consolidation path, but any National Treasury official sitting in the room listening to SRD thinks, great, these are the partial equilibrium results, but is it affordable, right? I think there's a bigger discussion, which I'll come back to later, around what are we trying to solve for in terms of the SRD. So if there's a discussion about, yes, but the SRD has done X or Y in terms of poverty, inequality, nutritional support, is there a macro discussion about how to resolve that in a social protection sense? And I'll park that for now. So in for example, Josh's paper, scalability as in nationally rolling out the scheme to every single animal, it's just not plausible, right? The TERS scheme is obviously true as well, right? Every single firm cannot get a wage subsidy for the next decade, right? And in Kelly's case, I think it's true. It's the area I know the least about, but I think she alluded to it, that every single quintile 1 through 4 school getting a support teacher, 2 per classroom, right? 1 per classroom, fiscally not feasible. So that's the micro-macro linkage that's really important, because we can do the national experiments and they're really useful and they're really important. But then the question for me is, and that's my second theme, is do they suggest any subgroup interventions? Do they suggest something really interesting that we could tweak or try creatively? So here's some ideas, some very controversial, as usual with me. The teacher assistants. If you're trying to resolve if you have a fiscal, let's assume there's a fiscal constraint and you're trying to resolve a learning deficit, but for outcomes that are not necessarily only learning deficit related, so I'm carefully couching it, but progression to higher education, right? Does one pick the schools that are the most highest performing, that's the controversial part, right? Because there's limited budget in the quintile 1, 2, 3 space. It's a little bit like that Dina Lady Schools initiative, right? Because then you can say, okay, well, we know. So I guess the broader point I'm making, which runs through all of this, is start with the assumption that there's a fiscal constraint, right? Because then the stuff is actually the rubber can hit the road, right? For Treasury and the Presidency. Okay, we know this is affordable. Now tell us if it actually works. And I think teachers' assistants start with a fiscal constraint, see what's affordable, and see if you can roll it out in whatever way. It doesn't have to be high-performing schools. It can be deep rural schools where you're actually taking the deepest learning deficits only, and you're resolving those. For TERS is the one I like the most, because I think there's some real possibilities there. For TERS, we have a collapsing, and Kate, you may just stop me when time runs out. We have a collapsing furniture sector because it's can't compete with Chinese imports, right? But it's labor intensive, and in the main, employs rural women in KZN. That's the furniture sector, but they cannot compete. So you have the minimum wage that comes in and half of them are forced to close down. Well, what if you had a TERS? But you could model that, right? What if a TERS came in, because it's only furniture firms, and that's eminently affordable, and you have this entire system that can support this. The UIF is set up to support these firms, because right, you just flip it back and you say, okay, well, your UIF, your unemployment insurance you've been paying now goes back as a wage subsidy. That seems to me so eminently doable. We partly did it for the president through the council when the UIF wanted to stop the TERS, if you recall. The TERS then was extended for a subset of firms in hotels and accommodation and so on that were particularly negatively affected by the pandemic. So it was a reduced form TERS, but it was this evidence that we could say, well, it's actually affordable, Mr. President, go ahead and do that. So there's a really good example. Josh, how about modeling, I like that, non-food vouchers, right? Because again, that could be affordable. I don't know what that looks like, but you can think of ways in which non-food vouchers based on this evidence would suggest something that's fiscally feasible. So on the SRD, what are we trying to solve for is a really important question, because if we have now, and it'll lead into my final point, this sort of heavy focus on households where we've now got CSG, old age pensions, and now the SRD pumping in, right? And then the natural response is keep it, otherwise you're going to see the floor falling out in terms of poverty and inequality and so on. So there are lots of ways to skin that, but just purely in terms of that approach, why don't we do, and I'm looking at Murray, the old stuff that we used to do on poverty and inequality simulations. You can do the numbers on this, right? You can shock the system and say, well, imagine we gave everybody, remove all the grants, and now we shock the system with what the minister calls a family grant or whatever. But you can model this and look at the impacts on poverty and inequality. You can look at the relative poverty effects. You can solve through proper data work, you can solve for what the most optimal grant solution is. And I don't think we've done that, right? And for me, that's where it's a really dangerous path, where you have a policy intervention designed to solve one issue, which is unemployment and informality as a consequence of a pandemic, and you keep it there because it's there. That seems like the worst possible reason to maintain a policy, right? It's almost the weakest form of policy engagement. Anyway, then my final point, which leads on to that, is I think we've reached a point, if we look at all our studies, all these excellent pieces that have been done, the entry point, apart from TERS, is the household. So how did we land up there? Why is the household the only point, right? Why is the informal sector not the entry point? Why are firms not also the entry point? I find it, and partly we do all this stuff because the data is really good, right? But I think it's also because, I think Lawrence was here earlier, but it's really difficult to get the DTI to tell you how much subsidy they offer for firms in the country, ever, at any data point for any firm. The DTI cannot give you that data. So we have a really poor supply side understanding. We don't think about firms, we don't think about incentivizing firms, and we don't think about a support package designed to firms across the distribution. And for me, that's almost the next stage. So if we have this again, and I'll stop there, it'll be nice to see sort of firm-based natural experiments for studies like this. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Haroon. I'm going to most uncharacteristically resist the temptation to be a discussant and open the floor. I've also done a much worse job at timekeeping than I thought I was doing. So we are pretty much out of time, but it is lunchtime and they've given us a whole hour. So if those who are willing to indulge a few more minutes, let's hope we can do so. Let's start in the corner. Oh, shall I? You're pointing as if there's another one.
So thanks, everyone. Just a couple of comments. I think that that there are ways in having a look at the first paper on multipliers to include some issues there. The one thing is around issues of household food security and child malnutrition, which I think is going to be significant. That groceries item is most likely maize meal. And which is the biggest household food expenditure in low-income households. And then I think also there's a multiplier effect that comes through equity in employment. So when retailers are increasing their employment, I think it's interesting to look at if they're employing more kind of low-skilled and unskilled people, that's got a significant equity impact through the employment multiplier, which I think is really interesting. On the education, I think that's fascinating, and I agree with your point, Kate, that if you retained people for longer, you'd address that scaling issue about training and have more of the teaching assistants. And I think the other interesting thing is to document the impact over time. So everybody says, students can't do anything at university because their foundational skills are so crappy. I mean, what happens to these students then when they move up into the next grade and the next grade and the next grade and the next grade? I mean, I think if you made a compelling case that actually this intervention at foundation level is then increasing educational outcomes all the way up the grade, there'd be an even more compelling case. And then finally, I mean, fiscal constraint. I mean, I don't think that means that you cut funds. I mean, you've got to be better at prioritization. Right, and if spending an extra 2.5 billion rand and an almost 30 billion rand education budget significantly increases the impact of that's got to be a prioritization issue. I mean, that increases value for money. And if the point of fiscal constraint is to increase value for money, it means you have to prioritize programs that work as opposed to just telling everybody to cut money from somewhere. And just on the furniture sector, so there is a national determination that government departments are supposed to spend 90% of their furniture budget with local firms, but they all get constant exemptions, so they don't.
Thank you. Next, Andrew in the front. Yeah.
Very quickly, Rob, you know what they say about financial Ponzi schemes, Ms. Rob. If it sounds too good to be true, it can't possibly be true. I don't understand what you mean by saved 2.7 million jobs. It is completely implausible that there would have been 2.7 million jobs less if we hadn't had TERS. And I think the problem is that you're characterizing what was actually an unemployment subsidy scheme as a wage subsidy scheme. It didn't work as a wage subsidy scheme. By the end of the program, you had to be almost 100% unemployed, staying at home, in order to get the benefit. It basically was an unemployment subsidy to the worker. The benefit to an employer was just about zero. The UIF refused to let employers retain the money. So I don't think it's plausible. I don't think you've got a plausible story behind the claim that this was about saving jobs. Okay.
Okay. Any other hands? One more, because clearly everybody actually really wants their lunch.
Okay, I'll be quick. I have two questions. One is for Tim. You mentioned that the way someone looks for work has changed. And I just want to understand that a little bit more, because if I remember correctly, one of the examples was it enabled people to, I think it was ask family members for money, like that. And I just wanted to find out a bit more about that mechanism. So you're saying that if they were given the social distress relief grant, that enabled them to ask more people or ask other people for money. So I just wanted to understand that mechanism. And then I have one for Callie. I just want to find out with the teacher training program, you were talking about you're not sure if it's scalable to like national level. At the moment, is it at like local government level, or or municipality level, that kind of thing? I just want to find out at what level it is at the moment, because I was thinking that it would be better at like local government level, especially if you're thinking of like with the financial constraint discussion, you could ask like, it would be easier to ask companies in local areas to be able to help and fund such initiatives. So for an example is Impala Platinum Mines, like the mines in Rustenburg, usually they actually have built a whole school, so it takes the pressure off government spending, so that can help relieve. So I'm just thinking like maybe rather not from a national perspective, but maybe from a local perspective. That's all. Thank you.
So we'll quickly allow for responses. Josh, anything you? Yeah.
Thanks. So just quickly in response to Haroon, I think you're absolutely correct that like at least our work is very much a question of macro and micro linkages. And I mean, that was one of our issues, is that Exxon and I are not macroeconomists. And so, like when it comes to estimating a multiplier, we're like, well, we don't have a marginal propensity to consume, so we can't do that. But other macroeconomists do have their ways of calculating that, and they can then apply that to their estimates and figure that out. But I do think a message that comes through from the work is basically that the spending, like fiscally, is not a black hole. It's not that the money goes to people and then it just disappears from the economy forever. Some of it does come back. I mean, in terms of wages or profits for firms, etc. And I mean, quantifying that is a question, and it's only the first part of the mechanism we look at. But I think that's one of the messages of the work. And then also just related on the SRD on simulations. And Saul is at the back there. The Presidency and then subsequently National Treasury did commission a team at Saldru to do these simulations on grants. And actually the SRD did pretty well. I mean, it was seen as like this, it's a work with Maya Goldman is the main person, and then also Ingrid, Murray, Linda Mzankoma from Treasury Ihsan. And so the SRD, like in terms of those questions of poverty alleviation and implementability, in that work at least came out pretty well. And for those who are interested, there's a more technical version of that paper forthcoming in the International Journal of Microsimulation. And then the last thing, just exactly to your question there about food security and malnutrition, etc. I do think, I mean, that's a really interesting question. Again, I'm not sure if Ihsan and I are all that equipped in terms of doing that, but one of the things we want to do is make the results in very detailed form available for other people, whether those are macroeconomists or people working on nutrition, etc., and they can do a better job than us in terms of figuring out those kind of impacts. Thanks.
Tim?
Thanks. I think I just got one question from Senzi. Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, so with respect to the mechanism, specifically on the grant the estimates suggest that receipt of the grant positively influence the probability that someone assists or asks for financial assistance from their relatives or family or friends. Right? Yeah, so basically to explore that mechanism, there's just one question in the survey that asks, okay, well, you indicated that you're looking for work, how? And there are a bunch of other options, multiple choice options that individuals can choose, all of which are applicable. We essentially ran the model on those individual binary variables separately. And the results that we get out here, again, preliminary, are suggestive of a positive effect on one particular or several domains, that being one of them. Thinking about how that happens, how could receipt of a transfer make someone be more willing to ask family and friends for money, is another question. I don't think there's another question in the survey that allows us to investigate that further. One might think about it as a sort of use of collateral for a sort of informal loan. Maybe that's one sort of mechanism, but I think it's all speculation at this point. Yeah, thanks.
Robert, you get the hot seat for your team.
Great. Yeah, I think the first thing maybe just to make mention of is, you know, as far as the TERS goes, it is a much bigger impact estimated than what we've seen for other types of subsidies, for sure. I would disagree about it being an unemployment subsidy, because you had to be able to prove an employment relationship, you know, between the worker and the firm. So being unemployed meant that you weren't allowed to claim the TERS. Whether, practically speaking, this meant that people were just sitting at home while their businesses were closed and collecting money to pay across, we don't know anything about that. But yeah, from a pure eligibility perspective, we do know that people had to have an existing employment relationship or be able to prove an employment relationship. So at least to that extent, that's, I think, why we've moved towards it being a wage subsidy. As I mentioned, there's a bit of debate about it. Is it 100% the right classification? We've gone backwards and forwards, but this is where we've landed the most comfortably. But yeah, your points are well taken. I think they are big effects compared to what you've seen in the literature, so maybe there is cause to look at them a little bit more closely. But yeah, this is what we found, and they are quite robust across a lot of different specifications.
And Kelly, please.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of the scalable thing, I think, I mean, there are two aspects. One is cost, but the other one is also sort of just quality at scale, like enough people to do it. So as Kate has mentioned, there's the ideas of maintaining, you know, some people in the system to become mentors. But I suppose also the two birds with one stone thing does allow you to sort of, you could take, you know, you can take money from an employment stimulus, and then because of the educational outcomes, one could tap into other pots to add that level of training and mentoring on top of it. And I think the solution that's being piloted at the moment that is much more narrow and focused and says we're just going in, we're going to focus on one grade, we're going to focus on a specific skill area, then you also reduce those training needs and so on. And I think speaking to the value for money, we know that the gaps start early on and then they just widen over time. So if I'm a grade 2 teacher and I inherit a class of 50 kids and half of them don't know the 26 sounds of the 26 letters of the alphabet, and I'm meant to follow this CAPS curriculum, I mean, the wheels are coming off. So so sort of being more targeted and saying, like, we don't want these youth to go and, I mean, we've evaluated other programs where it's sort of reading champion, doing a gazillion different activities. It doesn't seem to have good, I mean, doesn't seem to move the needle in educational outcomes. So I think one can try get around this training, those things, by being very, very targeted and focused is one potential way.
Thank you very much. And we're going to close there. Thank you, everybody, and have a good lunch.